Good evening. Is part of an ongoing set of conversations on post-independence literatures in the Indian languages under the auspices of the Writer in Context book series published by Routledge and helmed by the series editors Dr. Sukrita Paul Kumar and Dr. Chandana Datta. We thank them very much for giving us this opportunity to be part of this ongoing series and for also including us in this series, which promises to be a very significant contribution to pedagogy and scholarship on modern Indian literatures. The series, the Writer in Context series, aims to fill a lacuna in English literary studies in India, which tends to focus on Indian writers in the modern Indian languages other than English through material that is available only in English. And as a result, what happens is that there is a kind of limitation to the way in which the understanding of the writers is represented in a pedagogical and scholarly practices in English speaking academia, because we tend to not go deeper into the writer's full range of writings, their local context, their history, the local reception of their works in the language in which they write. And therefore, we find a kind of gap between the way in which these modern Indian writers are represented in English speaking academia, especially in institutions of higher education, and the way in which the same writers are read, studied, and talked about within their own cultural ethos. So, to bridge this gap, this series has selected certain iconic Indian writers and devoted individual volumes to each of them. And in these volumes, we connect through through English language translations and collections of writings on these writers and also their original works in a way that will give us a more rounded image of their work, a more three-dimensional image of their work, and situate them in their respective contexts. As a result, giving us, those of us who practice literatures in English in an institutionalized way, a broader and deeper understanding of how we can incorporate these writers into our understanding of modern Indian writing. So, the Writer in Context series has been organizing a series of conversations, and today's panel discussion is on the subject of gender and caste, literary engagements, and intersectionality. And we will be talking about these issues both in a general way, but also with reference to the series and to some of the writers we are focusing on in the Writer in Context series. We have with us two eminent speakers. Our third speaker, Dr. S. Armstrong, unfortunately had an emergency situation and he could not join us this evening. We have with us Dr. Raj Kumar and Dr. K.C. Muralidharan, and I will introduce them briefly, after which I will invite each of them to speak, to give us their initial inputs on the subject of the discussion. And then we will ask them to respond to each other and to elaborate on some of their thoughts. And then in the last part of the program, we will invite questions and observations from the listeners. So we do hope that you will participate actively in the discussion, and we invite our listeners, if they wish, to put some of their questions in the chat box so that we can take them up in the later part of the program. So I'll begin by introducing our speakers. Dr. Raj Kumar is an academic, translator, and critic. He teaches in the Department of English, University of Delhi. His area of research and teaching is Dalit studies. His books include Dalit Personal Narratives and Dalit Literature and Criticism, And he has also translated Akhila Naik's Bheda, the first Oriya Dalit novel. Dr. K.C. Muralidharan is former Associate Professor and Head of Department of English, Payanur College, Kannur University, Kerala, presently working as the principal of St. Joseph's College under the same university. Bilingual critic and translator with publications offline and online. He has edited 7 books for classes in Kannur University and some other universities outside Kerala. He is on the expert panel of the SCERT Textbook Writing Committee for Standard 1 to 12th for a decade, and his areas of interest include post-colonial literature, cultural studies, and Malayalam literature. So we're honored to have them with us. And to set the ball rolling, I'll request Dr. Raj Kumar to share his initial thoughts with us on the subject of gender, caste, and intersectionality in literary engagement.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Rekha, and good evening to everyone, all the listeners. It is nice to be with you all. But before I speak about the intersectionality of caste and gender, let me introduce the moderator of the this evening, Professor Radha Chakraborty. Professor Radha Chakraborty is a writer, critic, and translator, and also she was a professor till last month of comparative literature and translation studies at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. She has co-edited The Essential Tagore, which was published both by Harvard University and Vishwabharati Press, and it also got nominated as the Book of the Year 2011 by Martha Nussbaum. She has translated some of Tagore's major works into English. She is the author of Feminism and Contemporary Women Writers, and also another book called Novelist Tagore. She was nominated for the Crossword Translation Award in 2004 for the title In the Name of the Mother. This was a book by Mahashweta Devi. She has also edited several anthology of South Asian writing. Uh, Professor Radha's latest book is Our Santi Niketan, which just came out last month only, which is a translation of the memoirs of Mahasweta Devi. So, thank you, Professor Radha. Let me briefly talk about the way that I understand caste and gender and its intersectionality. This is very interesting, that area whereby we can try to enter into not just, that literary, the discourse. So I would like to bring, that in my first response to this topic, philosophical, historical, social, as well as literal. Now, that going by what we know about, that the caste and gender intersectionality, many historians and also social scientists, and I can name some, that among the historian, of course, Romila Thapar, Bhairavi Sahu, Vishwamapati, and Uma Chakrabarti, Charu Gupta. These are historians, and among social scientists, Sharmila Rege, Anupama Rao, and our that first anti-caste intellectual beginning from Phule to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, they have that written a lot about the intersectionality of caste and gender. What they that they would like to that tell us is that in India the emergence of caste and patriarchy was simultaneously. That this is one point that I just wanted to take up further, because caste and patriarchy emerged almost at the same time, and this is a product of caste system, and India, as I believe, is a caste society. And to prove my point, that I can go to the extent by saying that how these caste laws, and it is not just that Manu Shastra, there are also that more than 220 Dharma Shastras, which became instrument behind that controlling the movement and also the freedom of that women of all communities, and also Loka, Shudra, Atishudra, and women of all community. They are, that being circumscribed. So the whole idea here, that to introduce Dharma Shastra is to bring a kind of, that power at the hand of the upper caste, man particularly. And that is how, that we have to understand about how caste and gender at one point of time produce several marginal communities. Be, that Dalit, of course, Adivasi, and women of all community, I'm emphasizing. And the result of this, that were many. It is not that, a large population of India became what, that at one point of time, upper caste called them untouchables. And untouchables also, that they became unseeable, unapproachable, unhearable. The that women of India also became, that the victim of caste system, and that's why patriarchy became, that a much more, that thing to be discussed at this particular juncture. So I go to the extent by saying that these marginalized subject almost became slaves, that putting hard work. So the physical labor, that they had to do, whether it is low caste man, that, and of course women of all community, as I said. Now education, which is that most important, that part of human life, was denied on the name of religion. So a large chunk of India's population for a very long time, that till perhaps the British came to India and missionary, the thanks for missionary, that education where, that was open up. And I will go to the extent by saying that women of all community for that matter, that they could not have an education. So the example that we know now, Rasa Sundari Devi's Amar Jivan, that my life
Mm.
happens to be the first India's women's autobiography. And that got published in, that 1868 to be precise. Why did it take so long for a woman, whether she is, of course, upper caste woman, to write her autobiography? Now, I will go to the extent by saying that beginning from only mid 19th century, things changed. As I suggested that, thanks for the missionary, that. So the idea of Dalit women availing education gave a much more, that chance to open up, that new vista, new knowledge, new articulation, new subjectivity. And that's where we go back to mid 19th century, whereby I talk, say, Jyotiba Phule was the first anti-caste intellectual to not only, the question this whole idea of Dharma Shastra, because his book called Gulamgiri, which was published in 1873, is a major critic of, that Indian caste system, and of course, that whereby he puts Dasavatara, the idea of, that 10th incarnation of Vishnu, as a major critic to, that enslave the marginalized community. Phule and his wife Savitribai Phule were the first couple in India to set up a school for untouchable boys and girls. 1854 to be precise. This was for the first time that the low caste, both boys and girls, they could avail education. Now, that this idea of, that intervention, particularly in the public sphere, was a major, perhaps, that contribution by an anti-caste intellectual like Phule, which was, of course, later taken forward by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, Terrier, and there are too many, that anti-caste intellectual, Manguram from Punjab, Achyutanand from Uttar Pradesh, Harichand Thakur and Guruchand Thakur from Bengal, and, too many things. And what we now find is Indian Constitution, of course, thanks for Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, that education was made compulsory. And it is only in post-independence India that lots and lots of marginalized community, be it Dalit, Adivasi, of course, women of all community, they have well education and could articulate. So when I talk about caste and gender, and particularly its intersectionality, that look at the way, that the first and foremost thing that we have to know is once education was not available, people of course could speak out, that, but then the idea of documenting, and that's why our series, writer series, which is, that a big weight, that we are going to archive, that what is not being, that said earlier, particularly Indian writers, so be it Bama, Mahaswita Devi, or maybe, that Amrita Pritam, or, that Krishna Shakti, or many others. So this is where, that I understand, Professor Radha, the idea of intersectionality that we are going to do now had a lot to do with also archiving what happened in the past and how to read the past in the present time.
Yeah.
I think, that for the moment, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for giving us this kind of historical overview of how intersectionality has always been part of our social processes and structures, and how simultaneously caste and gender forms of oppression based on caste and gender emerged in our history, and how subsequently they were resisted, and the changes and transformations that came about as a result of a growing awareness and people beginning to raise their voices and take active steps to alter the existing state of things. So I think this really sets the tone very well for the discussion to come by contextualizing it in this way. I will now invite Dr. K.C. Muralidharan to come in with his initial ideas on the subject.
Thank you, Radha and Rajkumar. I would begin with an account of Malayalam novel Discourse in the first phase of 100 years, starting with 1858 to about 1960s. We know that this 100 years is a period in which the Indian middle class, the rising Indian middle class, was shaping its cultural artifact, the novel, in the language of its, in the mother tongue as well as in the colonial language. We find in these times novels coming up from different experiential occasions that are related to reform, nationalism, conversion, women's empowerment. But all these novelistic discourses, though different in their own way from different subcultures, had certain things in common. They were all homogenizing discourses that, or those downplayed dissent and differences to project an India that was what we can call now a soft Hindutva India, where things were decided according to caste, upper caste, and patriarchal interests. So, in these 100 years, in the case of Kerala, at the point of emergence, or rather points of emergence, about more than 15 novels were written and published. Most of these novels were representations, not self-representations, actually. There were novels about Dalit communities getting converted and acquiring literacy, coming into the modern space, doing things. There were novels dealing with class. There were novels dealing with, the development of women. The first novel in the sense that it was not considered novel later by novel in the course of time. Actually, these novels were suppressed and excluded from being called novels. The first novel, anyway, it was a prose narrative which can claim the title of a novel, was this story of two women called Fulmoni and Koruna. It was first translated into Bengali, and later in 1858 it is translated to Malayalam also. Following it, we have more than dozen novels speaking about dealing with conversion, new literacy, women coming up, women discussing their issues. Moralistic novels were there. And of these 12 novels, along with them, the middle class was not simply shaping the artifact, the novel, but also theorizing the novel in such a way that the upper caste concerns became prominent in defining them. This we can understand when we look back upon the points of emergence of the Malayalam novel and how they were categorized and excluded. I would like to point out two novels, especially one by Appu Nadungadi, Kunthalada, the other written after that by O. Chandumenon, Intulega. Intulega is projected as the Malayalam novel, and later the literary critical discourses and literary historiography were constituted in such a way that novel in Malayalam signified only Intulega. This was because though there was renaissance among all the communities in Kerala, the middle class Nair communities who received education and the modern epistemological tools started writing about other castes and other experiential locations of other people in such a way that they have suppressed these writers through both literary criticism, critical accounts, and literary historiography. And it was done by constructing certain categories like Kerala novel. And then when Kerala novel was, Kerala novel is the novel of Kerala life, some of the translations were kept out. And most of these translations were about women and Dalit communities written from the interface of conversion, where they got the freedom to attend schools and learn languages and new ways of life, which was not allowed in the Hindu caste. So such novels were called propagandist and thus excluded. Gradually, the second novel, which was considered to be prominent at that time, Kundalada, was also put to scrutiny according to the classification and definitional interests of Euro-centered novels in such a way that Appunadungadi's novel, Kuntalata, was also written off as a romance. Romance in the sense that he placed his novel away from Kerala in a North Indian kingdom and brought in characters who were not so familiar with the culture of Kerala. So it was written off as romance, as we see in the case of English novels also. English novels were preceded by romances. So the same pattern was brought into the classification of Malayalam novels, and in the name of romance, in the name of Kerala novel, in the name of what is called the perfect novel, the full-fledged novel, all these are words used for classifications. At the after 50 years, at the turn of the century, in 1900, 1901, Intulega was accepted as a novel that could stand up to any other novel in English particularly, and also novels from other languages. With these, it is interesting to note that all the rest of the novels which were published were not reprinted, were not read, were not even spoken about for nearly 150 years. Only in 2004 or so, I think, or after 2010, I think, 10 or 12, these novels were reprinted and accepted as novels. So we find literary historiography and literary criticism, even forwards, working in favor of the upper caste Nair Renaissance and its product, cultural product, that is Intulega. So Intulega was established as the progressive novel. The element of progress, especially women's education, was one of the factors that gave it the label of actually the progressive novel. And here, when we think of from the point of view of intersectionality, we can understand that it was not the independence of education, independence of women through education, liberation of women through education, emancipation of women through education. It was the emancipation, or it was the cultural conquest of the Kerala society by the Nair caste, not representative of all the communities that were living in India then and even now. So the Renaissance in Kerala, the cultural awareness in Kerala is reduced to Nair Renaissance, suppressing all other Renaissance for a very long time. And their writings were discussed, and they started writing, and the marginal voices were heard only at the turn of the 21st century, especially the Dalit community. Women from Nair community were writing, and their case was also very interesting. When we connect it to Vijayan, Vijayan was born in 1930, July. We had in Kerala a writer, a woman writer, a very promising woman writer called Rajalakshmi, born in June 1 month difference in 1930 itself. And she was a college teacher. She wrote 3 novels, some collections of short stories. And we find that by 1965, before Vijayan's first novel came out, Rajalakshmi committed suicide. So 2 writers from 2 genders. I'm not drawing very heavy conclusions from individual incidents like that, but I should say this shows how even an upper class woman finds it difficult to continue with her creative, engagements. And it was, usually talked about that she had to face bitter criticism from the society for writing novels and engaging herself in cultural activities like this. And she ends her life hanging. And she was found dead in her room, hanging on a sari. So these 2 incidents, the historiography, literary historiography, the literary critical engagement with the earlier novels of Malayalam, and the life of this woman, this writer, an upper caste woman, a Nair woman, tells us that Intulega, written years before Rajalakshmi's death, remains, in the case of even upper caste women, only a desire to be free and liberated, to be empowered. These 100 years did not actually create an atmosphere for empowerment for even for upper class women, and not at all for Dalit community and women of other communities. We find that the subaltern does not speak. They were speaking through those who represented them, especially people from other communities. And this is what I have to say at this point.
Radha? The network is low,
Hello?
no?
Hello? I think,
Murali?
it is, I think
Yeah.
her connection is, there is something wrong with her connection.
Poor.
So shall I continue a few more minutes?
We have already,
So I would say,
half an hour.
I would continue that from 1858 to 1900 is the time of the emergence of these novels. And I find that these are, as I made it very clear, these were representations and not self-representations. And it is in the 1960s that we come across, writers like Vijayan. At this time, I find, the nation, we find a critical rupture in the relationship between the nation and the novel that shaped the nation, cultural landscape of the nation. We find the native governments in power. We have become post-colonial, at least in the political sense. And we find that the post-colonial governments found that the novel was of less and less use. And the novel, for them, was something of a threat to, because they being subversive, and there were actually interventions from the margins after 1960s. We find that the writer in context series is about writers who come in this period, the period around 1950s, after 1950s, when these writers were facing a new kind of reality, a new kind of neo-colonial reality, where the claims of the nation state was not fulfilled, where people were suffering at the margins, where the constitutional values were not met, and people were suppressed and exploited in large numbers. At this point, we find the new kind of writing coming up. Vijayan can be located in this space where, when he starts writing this novel, he was disenchanted with communism, with the Russian, Russian, in the Russian context of Stalinist cruelties. Vijayan distances himself from, his communist interests, and his hero, the protagonist who comes to actually Kasak, Devi, is a person who is finding himself nowhere ideologically. And this is a point, I think, where Vijayan comes to be represented in the Writers in Context series, where a new kind of writing comes into being, the modernist kind of writing comes into being, which reacts in the form of language, in the form of innovations, in the form of experience, innovations and experiments against the realist tradition in Kerala. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I had lost the connection and had to, rejoin the program. But thank you very much for this detailed account of the Kerala Renaissance and the underlying politics of it, and the way in which you have located O.P. Vijayan, the writer you are focusing on for the Writer in Context series, in order to connect his work with our discourse. I think the time has come for us to quickly respond to each other in the next round of this panel discussion. And perhaps we can broaden the discussion a little to talk about the implications of intersectionality when we look at representations of gender and caste in literary engagements. And here, if we look at the broader map of what was happening in literatures in post-independence India and connect this with questions of, some of the debates around modernity and modernism, progressive writing, experiments with language, questions of aesthetics, particularly the question of the intersection between politics and aesthetics, which comes up when we are talking about literatures in relation to marginalized groups. And I'm reminded here of Sharan Kumar Limbale's demand for a separate aesthetic for Dalit writing, which goes against the mainstream aesthetic ideals and demands that a different set of yardsticks be formulated to deal with a new kind of reality which has been, obscured from view due to the politics of representation. Also, questions of translation and circulation of these texts and connections across isolated pockets to think of a broader picture of the discourse of gender and caste and intersectionality. I'll invite Professor Rajkumar to respond, and then I'll request Dr. Muralidharan to also come in, please.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Radha. If we talk about literary engagement, that and intersectionality, we know that Dalits, particularly, that or low caste, they could not write because education was not available to them. As I said in my last, that discussion, that it is only after post-independence, in post-independence, that India, that they could avail education in a bigger way. Of course, today, if we see literacy, it is not, that. Uh, s- satisfying so far as Dalit women are concerned or Adivasi women are concerned. But nevertheless, that Dalit studies as a new discipline has already made a presence felt, not just in India but also abroad. And this is where, that I'll just go back to the idea of literary history, that first, that when we talk about India's literary history, of course, the upper caste man first started writing about Dalit, which could be termed as that romanticization of Dalit lives and culture. So the first Indian novel that we come to know is Malapalli by Unnava Lakshminarayana way back in 1921, and after that, of course, there are several writers, that progressive writers, including Premchand, Mulk Raj Anand, that Thakaji Shankar Pillai, and Gopinath Mohanty, and in between, of course, too many, that Arundhati Roy, Ananta Murthy, Mahasweta Devi, and, that Manoj Joseph. So, too many, that writers. But what is very interesting about, that Dalit articulation, that only after 1972, when Dalit painters came together in Maharashtra to have a platform, common platform. These are Dalit writers and activists coming together in 1972. That there was a larger, that Dalit articulation being form of literature or art or culture or maybe the painting now. Now, 1972 was a marker for Dalit subjectivity, and Dalit, as we all know, is a political term whereby it defies all the negative terms that that we are talking about caste society. Now, it did not take that much time because from 1972 to 1991, I remember 1991 was the year of social justice and empowerment. This was also birth centenary of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, whereby all his writings and speeches, that got collected, published, and in a big way, that the idea of Dalit emancipation, freedom, came to the public all over India. And that is how Dalit writings took up, that a big shot maybe. So we find now, that not just Dalit men writing, but also Dalit women. So I will, that concentrate more on, the caste and gender, talking about, say, writers like Bama, because her book Karuku got published in 1992 when we were, celebrating Ambedkar's birth centenary in 91, 92. So Bama, Baby Kamble, Urmila Pawar, Jyoti Lanjewar, Minakshi Moon, P. Shivakami, Sushila Takbore, Meena Kandasamy, Anita Bharati, Supriya Malik. No, these are some of the names that they belong to different languages. But what is very interesting about these writers, Dalit women writers, that they articulate not just about their individual self, they also write about the collective. That. So mostly, of course, autobiographical, but there are also poetry, novels, plays, and of course, that critical essays. Now, the first thing that I want to draw your attention to is there is a new language. The idea of articulating the subjectivity in a language which was earlier missing in Indian literature. This is the ordinary and common language of the people. So, for the first time, people's language is coming to literary discourse. Now, when it comes to the translation, because most of them they write in Indian languages, and maybe the few like uh, P. Sivakami or Mina Kandasamy, they write in English. Now, if I can use this word, that the Dalit idioms, everyday, that spoken language of ordinary and common people coming to the purview of literature now and getting translated into it, that because for the non-Indian, of course, reader, it has to be, that given a big, maybe, that exposure to the world outside, that India, but also, that within India, say, Bama's Karukku, which is the first, that autobiographical writing that also got crossword award. And Bama is also, the part of our series whereby we are trying to, that bring all her writings together to say that there is not only a new language, but also new aesthetic, as you very rightly said. And this idea of new aesthetic is, the question, the whole idea of Rasa and Dhwani theory, as you very rightly say, there are two critical books on Dalit aesthetic, one by Sharan Kumar Limbale, but the other one is also, that by Om Prakash Valmiki, Dalit Sahitya Ka Saundarya Shastra, whereby Dalit writers are not only questioning the whole idea of Rasa and Dhwani, they are questioning also Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram, these three concepts, but trying also to talk about how literature can bring a total revolution in Indian society. Literature is not for pleasure, but also to bring a social change. And that is where, the Dalit writers, they are, they, that they are not just writing about their own community or by, that about them, also about establishment. So sometimes, that you feel that they are also anti-establishment, for example. Sometimes, that they also talk about the way the other writers they look down upon, say the idea of romanticization. I can give you any number of examples whereby Dalit women, beginning from the Premchand to Mulkraj Anand to Ananta Murthy, how that the women, Dalit women are being romanticized, a sexual body or over sexualized body. Anantamurthy, for example, in Sanskara, writes about Chandri, as if she's an Indian heroine called Sakuntala, that ready to that to be seduced. So all these are that to be counteracted by Dalit women's writer. What is also very interesting about Dalit women writing about, because according to sociology, they are trebly marginalized, not just caste, also class and gender. Now, that Dalit women are also writing about Dalit patriarchy, which was earlier not being discussed by Dalit men in their writings. Baby Kamle's The Prison We Broke is the best example where I see brings a critique of Dalit patriarchy. Now, there are also other way to understand about, that literary engagement as we see. Say, I can just give few examples that say in the creative field, say Bama's Karuku, Sangati, for example, or Vendetta. Baby Kamle's The Prison We Broke, Urmila Pawar's, for example, Weave of My Life. That the cultural capital that is coming in a big way, apart from new language and new aesthetic. Earlier, that Dalit culture never came to the public fora to be not only, that discussed, also to be understood, for example. P. Sivakami's Grip of Change talks about, that how Dalit patriarch could be, that not only violent, but also dangerous for Dalit community. And she's a critic of, the Dalit patriarch. Now, all these, that writings or Sushila Tagore, Sikanji Ka Dard, that this is in Hindi, and Anita Bharti's Choti Panno Ke Udan. These are some of the autobiographical writing whereby they talk about not just about themselves, also about their community, culture, that the way Dalit women subjugation to be counteracted. So to that come to a conclusion, maybe that when we talk about the idea of say Dalit women's writing particularly, we come to know about that many of the things which were earlier not available to the readers, particularly Indian readers or that readers outside the world, by that showcasing, say a writer series. We have Bama, for example, and Bama is a unique example how she is now being that made famous not just in India, also abroad. That many of her writings are being part of uh, university syllabus. And that's why that it is high time that we showcase Dalit women's writing, particularly that in the writer series I'm talking about, whereby many of the unsung that heroines, in our case Bama, of course, that immediately, but there are also very many Dalit writers, that particularly Dalit women's writer who are writing about not just caste, also say conversion, for example. Bamas is a very unique case to talk about, that how she critiques Christianity, the caste and conversion, as at one point of time Dr. Murali actually talked about. So it is not just caste, also class, gender, ethnicity, religion, region, nationalism, that they talk about. So, that this writers series that we are, that aiming at brings so much diversity and plurality into understanding of Indian, the society, that I'm sure, that will be able to, present Indian literature in general, and that of course world literature, maybe that sorry, Dalit literature in particular through Bama and others, to showcase that very many things. So maybe that I'll stop here, Radha. Uh,
Sorry, I had muted myself. So this was at the same time comprehensive and yet very, very focused and detailed, and it showed up the question of how intersectionality actually works in these discourses. Now, I'll now invite Dr. K.C. Muralidharan to make his, responses. We do not have too much time, but we are still hoping that we can maybe fit in a couple of questions from the audience after this. So please do come in, and perhaps you might want to speak about the modernist attitude to language and the politics of self, and also the politics of translation in the case of O.P. Vijayan, or you may wish to respond to some of the things that we have been saying so far. Please
Okay.
do share your
Okay.
thoughts with us.
I think the when Vijayan came on the scene as a writer, especially the modernist emerged, modernist writing emerged. It was just after years of nationalism and nation formation, nation state formation. And nationhood is always connected to language. And difference in languages were thought to be the basis of nationhood. Right from the beginnings of 15th century in Western countries, especially Europe. Here also, going after the fashion of gathering ourselves into geographical units called nations, or which there were thousands of languages, we too followed the Western structures in such a way that the inception of the nation demanded standardization of languages, linguistic purism, and efforts to shape a national language. It is in this context that most of the modernist writers are engaged in their writing. We find that a modernist writer like one of the prominent modernist writers of Kerala, like Vijayan, challenges this protectionism towards language and conservation of linguistic purity by bringing in all kinds of dialects into the imaginary land, imaginary village that he conceived. And not only that, Vijayan took 12 years to complete the revision of the novel. He started it years back in 58, but it was published in 68 and published serially in, a, in Madhubhumi, serially, and then published as a book in 1969. So we find that the modernists pay great attention to an alertness towards language, bringing in every dialect and sociolect available in the area they were writing about. So we find such dialects coexisting, contesting, and growing peacefully against the standard Malayalam that was being shaped. So the novel, Vijayan's novels, especially the first two novels, we find are written in a new kind of language, in a radical kind of language, which has the capacity to deal with the real and also the mythical and the supernatural. And this kind of keenness is seen in other writers also. For instance, uh, Krishna Sopti's one of her first novels, written in 1959, I think, Channa, the novel Channa, written in 1959, and the manuscript handed over to publishers for printing, was retrieved, taken back, and the printed copies destroyed on the question of language. She was mixing Punjabi and Hindi, and the editors, publishers wanted to sanitize that. And she retrieved the manuscript, destroyed the printed copies, and it was published after 60 years as her last novel. The first came to be published after 60 years as her last novel. And this also shows the keen interest, the keen political interest that modernist writers usually place on language. Coming to translation, self translation, Vijayan has translated most of his works into English. But in Kerala, it has been studied very studiously, and we find that Kasakinde Idihasam and its translated into English version, The Legends of Kasak, are not translations, are two novels, two different novels. What happens in this is, it was translated 25 years after he wrote Kasakinde Idihasam in Malayalam. And within these 25 years, Vijayan changed ideologically, his worldview changed, and we find two Vijayans. And the one Vijayan who wrote the dialogic, polyphonic Kasakindi Dihasam, was not the Vijayan who translated it. So that what happened was, minor changes in the language actually extracted the existence or actually silenced the existence of the dialects in it. And he has revised it. It was not a translation, actually, it was a reworking in such a way that the novel ceased to be in English, it ceased to have the qualities that were revolutionary in the case of Malayalam. This later Vijayan, who was spiritual, with some changes here and there made in the translation, brought in, instead of ethnic groups, he brought in the whole communities into castes and castes working within the framework of Hinduism. And also the Rautar and another community, two communities, when it is translated into English, is expressed in the vocabularies of colonialism into Hindu-Muslim binaries. So what we find in Vijayan, translation in Vijayan is a kind of reworking that he makes, and he sanitizes the novel regarding the sexual escapades of the hero, and such self-writing also takes place, Righting, in the novel, as some of the critics like Chitra Panikar has in detail, has explored in detail. So translation, or one should be faithful to the text, the translator, or the author, are some questions that can be raised in this context. So he was, as a translator, Vijayan was faithful to himself, not to the text that he produced some years ago.
If I may come in, we are running out
Yeah.
of time here. So
Okay.
we may have to end the session because I'm not sure that it's already 10 past 9, I believe.
Yes,
Um,
9:10.
so I think we will have to forego the interaction with the audience. Thank you very much, Dr. Muralidharan, and thank you very much, Dr. Rajkumar, for this wonderful and very rich discussion. Obviously, there is much more to be said on the subject, and we hope that the series Writer in Context will continue to raise more such debates and discussions, which need to obviously be elaborated on in a longer forum than this. So, with this, I thank KLF, I thank the Writer in Context series, and I thank both of you very much for this panel discussion. And I think we need to end the session here. Thank you very much.
We thank you, Professor Radha, for moderating. Yeah,
Thank you
thank you
very
all.
much. Thank you. Okay.
Thank
Bye
you. Thank
bye.
you both.
Thank you. All
Thank
the
you,
best. Bye
Dr.
bye.
Raj and Radha.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye. Goodbye.